Good morning, Revolution, and good morning, everyone. We are here today at a very, um, in some sense, dark and dangerous moment. Um, we've just seen uh, the attack on Venezuela, the kidnapping of President Nicolás Maduro and First Lady Cilia Flores, a political leader in her own right, and also here in the United States, the murder of Renee Nicole Good in Minneapolis by ICE agents, shot through her car window at point blank range, and the shooting of two more uh, people in Portland by federal agents. So the need for mass resistance to this lawless regime has never been higher. And we're going to talk about that this morning. I'm joined by Rosana Camdron, co-chair of CPUSA, and also by Steve Ellner. Steve is a retired professor of um, history and political science at Universidad de Oriente in Venezuela, and also associate managing editor of Latin American Perspectives and a frequent writer on left and anti-imperialist movements throughout Latin America. Thank both of you very much for joining us. Steve, are you joining us from Venezuela right now?
No, no, I'm in Maryland outside of Washington, D.C.
Ah, all right. Um, and Rosanna, you're in Los Angeles. So where the two of you are, what's happening on the ground in terms of um, pushback and protest against these latest moves by the Trump administration?
Well,
Rosanna?
here in Los Angeles, immediately, I believe that the same day, even though it's pouring rain in Los Angeles, at least 1,000 people showed up in the downtown area protesting the kidnapping of the Maduros and protest and continuing calls to Congress and all of the kind of resistance format is happening here in Los Angeles and really throughout the country.
Thank you. Steve, what's going on in the DC area?
Well, in the D.C. area, there a protest practically every day. Tomorrow, there's one I think outside of the White House. But I wanted to make reference, Scott, to Venezuela and the fact that there are mobilizations in Venezuela against the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and the First Lady Cilia Flores. And it's significant to point out that although Venezuelan politics has been very polarized, just like here in the United States, but that ever since the presence of Marines in the Caribbean, that President Maduro called for a united front of sorts, a popular front, or, in opposition to U.S. aggression, and that it's very significant that he has succeeded in mobilizing and reining in different sectors on the political spectrum, even sectors what I would call the center right. In other words, opposition leaders such as the ex-presidential candidate Enrique Capriles, who ran against Chavez and then against Maduro in 2013, but nevertheless broke with Maria Corina Machado, who represents the far right in Venezuela. These people are opposing U.S. aggression against Venezuela. And one of the top organizations historically, Democratic Action, historically the largest party in Venezuela, divided in two. And one of the factions, that leader, Bernabe Gutierrez, called on Venezuelans to enlist in the militia so that there is a popular movement that goes beyond the Chavista movement in Venezuela opposed to U.S. aggression.
Thank you, and that's really useful to know, and I think important to point out, because there is still this line being pushed by, in the capitalist media in the United States, that the whole Venezuelan opposition and a big chunk of the Venezuelan people are welcoming the U.S. with open arms, and it seems like Rosanna here we've seen there was an initial pushback against the invasion of Venezuela among even some sections of the ruling class, but it seems like now uh, there's a moment of like pearl clutching or something, right? And then they kind of started to fall in line and say, "Oh, at least now democracy can flourish." Is What do we make of this tendency of the anti-Trump forces to fall in line behind uh, this action?
Well, excuse me. I think we have to be very careful about what we believe and what we think we know. We have to always look deeper in order to make sure that we don't fall prey to some of this propaganda that really uh, that causes us to move against our own best interest. That we're really clear about what's really happening. That we're clear that every nation deserves to determine their own path. That we are nobody to be telling other countries what to do and all of that kind of a thing. We can't believe this whole idea about the drugs and all of this kind of stuff. We have to look at the real picture, the entire picture. And so I think the nation here is learning how to do that with these situations. Just with the killing of Nicole Good and other incidents that have happening with ICE and all that. I think the people of this country are learning to look deeper and to resist, because really, if we don't resist, we're not going to win, and we're going to let them win, and that's just horrifying for all of us.
Thank you. Yeah, and I agree. It does seem that there's this. People are being pushed to look at things in a deeper way. And one of the, I don't know, memes or whatever that's trending on social media is people just saying, "I know what I saw on that video," and linking it to the attempted coup on January 6th, 2021. Here, I know what I saw on January 6th. I know what I saw on January 7th. So that's extremely important. Um, and I guess to kind of get into this topic, um, the title of our show today is "You Can't Jail the Bolivarian Revolution." So I'd like to kind of talk about the history of the Bolivarian movement, the Bolivarian project, um, and its impact on in Latin America, on the left outside of Latin America. I was barely of voting age when Hugo Chavez was elected, and I certainly wasn't part of the communist movement yet. Um, and yeah, so I'd be interested to hear from both of you. Maybe uh, Steve, what is the Bolivarian Revolution? What do we mean by that?
Well, Scott, first, Bolivariana refers to Simon Bolivar, who's the father of Venezuelan independence, and inspired Chavez specifically in the movement that he led. But the real question is, why revolution? Why do we call it revolution? And I believe that the term revolution is appropriate because from the very outset, there was a radicalization process. In the beginning, when Chavez was first elected president in 1998, it was mainly about political reform. And that became implemented in the form of a new constitution just a year after Chavez was elected president, that was ratified in a national referendum. But it was mainly about political reform and specifically participatory democracy. But then 2 years later, in 2001, it entered an anti-neoliberal stage. So that's part of the radicalization process, and specifically an agrarian reform and a oil law, a new oil law that was passed in September of 2001, which was nationalistic. And that led into the coup against Chavez. There was resistance on the part of the right. But then after that, up until then, Chavez was very discreet in what he said about the United States. But after that coup attempt that the United States supported and a general strike, which was really a lockout in December of 2002, January 2003, Chavez became an anti-imperialist. So that enters a new stage, anti-imperialism. And then in 2005, Chavez declares himself socialist. And shortly after that, in 2007, after he is reelected, he implemented socialist programs, nationalization of steel, cement. The oldest bank was taken over, the Banco de Venezuela, etc. So I think the point has to be made that Chavez succeeded in taking advantage of every situation, every favorable situation. He took advantage in order to radicalize the process. In fact, it was called in Spanish all the time, it's called the process. So why do we call it Bolivarian revolution? Because it was a process of radicalization that began in the first year that Chavez was elected president.
Thank you. Um, and Rosanna, um, the this process happened, at a moment where it seems like a lot of the left, kind of worldwide, was in retreat. Still after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the setback to the world socialist movement. What was the reaction like here in the United States, or elsewhere that you're familiar with, to um, the the beginning of the Bolivarian process and this new anti-imperialist push?
Excuse me. Well, I can only I was fairly young or younger than then, and I can only share my experience. I went to Venezuela in 2005 when it was just I guess when Hugo Chavez had just declared himself socialist. I really don't remember the time frame, but what I do remember is that back then, they have these kiosks, a medical kiosk in every community. What I remember is that they had the where like, kind of like a general state store where you can get 60% off the basic needs, basic goods, and education was free, and uh, you know people were their needs are being met. And some people could say, well, they just showed you all the good stuff. No, what I saw was in the faces of the Venezuelan people, in the faces of the children, the relaxed and less stressed nature of their being, because they no longer had to worry about these basic needs. And that's really key. And I think that Chavez and the revolution made sure that people felt that change. And I think also that Chavez educated people all along in all of his speeches. If you listen to them, he didn't just, say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, but he educated folks to bring them into this realm of understanding that needed to be, that they needed in order to resist the right and their attacks. And I think that that has mounted to the point that has allowed the people to understand that they need to defend their country, irregardless of what they think about Maduro or anything, But the idea of being sovereign, and and a free nation, not to be taken over by imperialist countries, is I think it's very cemented, and is what's going to keep the Venezuelan people resisting.
Thank you. And thinking of that anti-imperialist and that sort of national liberation basis of the Bolivarian movement, that the name comes from, it, refers to. In fact, that's that seems to be a sort of Venezuela is not the only country where that has happened. The Cuban Revolution also began as, in my understanding, a national liberation, anti-imperialist, and pro-democracy movement, right? And then became declared itself socialist later. Steve. Oh, I think you're muted, Steve. Oh, oh no,
Okay,
no,
can
never
you?
mind. You're good. You're good. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, there are definite similarities and also differences. After all, the Cuban Revolution was through an armed struggle. In the case of Venezuela, you have had an opposition much stronger than in the case of Cuba, supported by the United States. It was a combination in Venezuela between the United States that opposed Chavez almost from the beginning, not the first 2 years, but after that, by the year 2001, the United States was, and as a matter of fact, after Chavez criticized the bombing in Afghanistan, that was a turning point, that the United States went full speed against the Chavez government, and it's been that way ever since. So that there are similarities and differences with regard to Cuba. But I think that what is important is that the anti-imperialist movement um, comes at a time in the after 1998 when imperialism was really not being considered in an important way, not even on the left, because globalization set in the 1980s and especially in the 1990s, and there was a sense that imperialism had been transcended, that imperialism was no longer a force, and especially with the collapse of the Soviet Union, this feeling was quite dominant. Chavez comes along, and I think the importance of Chavez is that the coup that he staged in 1992, he became famous because of that coup that occurred just weeks after the collapse of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. So this sense that Venezuela was facing the United States, was facing an imperialist power, and a president that recognized that after the general strike or the general lockout in 2002, 2003, Chavez began talking about imperialism, became an anti-imperialist. So that I think that that is one of the most significant aspects of the Chavista phenomenon, that it really placed anti-imperialism front and center. And it's, I think, influenced people in the left in particular ever since.
Thank you. Um, so the um, the United States has been pressuring Venezuela for a long time. Pressuring is a generous term. Beginning with supporting the 2002 coup, through designating Venezuela as an extraordinary threat to national security under Obama, through sanctions regimes of increasing severity, designed to um, weaken the economy and force people into um, discontent with the government, funding of all sorts of opposition movements and groups. Um, Rosanna, what kind of impact does people talk about the need for democracy in Venezuela? That kind of intervention, what does it do to the space um, for democracy in a country?
Um, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch your full
Oh,
question.
I'm sorry. Yeah, the so when people are always talking about the need that was the big reason, right, for all of this intervention in Venezuela, the need to promote democracy. Um, but when you have this pressure of sanctions and everything, how does it what does that do to the space for democracy?
Well,
Sorry, problem on my end.
I think we have to, be very mindful of the propaganda, and the use of the words that try to twist things around and try to help get people to not look at the real picture and focus their attention not on the real enemy but on other create these enemies, that the use of the word democracy. Oh, we've got to go and defend democracy. Well, what does that really mean? How do we know that that's really what's happening? um, And so we have to, once again, we have to look deeper. You know, we're in this battle of ideas that it really requires us to look deeper into things, to read more, to look at different sources, you know, on both sides, so that you can really get a good picture of things. um, you know, this whole use of the word, you know, we're going to go in because of the drugs. They know that you know, people are concerned about drugs. We see, you know, drug abuse and addiction there, you know, in our country. So we're concerned about it. We're concerned about crime. We're concerned about jobs, and instead of and they make us think that, you know, they're really look that the real enemy is the drug lord, or the, you know, the immigrant, or the crime, or anything like this. And all of that deters us from looking at who's really exploiting us. You know, the fact that we have uh, our tax dollars, 51 plus now percent of our tax dollars goes to the military, and that it does nothing to keep us safe, but yet we're continually cutting. We're having children dying of starvation here. We have homeless people, unprecedented, you know. In any other country, you do not see that. And in other, even poor countries, and in this rich country, the richest country in the world, we we don't have universal health care. Every other country has it and we don't. Why is that? We need to ask these questions instead of allowing them to focus our attention on stuff that's not real, on stuff that really is not the cause of what we're experiencing here in the United States. I hope that answers your
Yeah,
question.
well, it's I mean, it's an excellent point, right? Because as you know, we watched the U.S. government for decades talk about democracy promotion throughout the world. We need to promote democracy here. We need to, you know, replace this or that repressive, you know, allegedly repressive regime there. All the while, you know, the attack on labor rights here, the attack on women's rights, the attack on the rights of racially and nationally oppressed people intensified, and nothing was done about it, and you know, intensified, you know, along the rhythm of the increasing funding for the military, and Trump has, in a certain sense, um, you know, laid bare the absolutely undemocratic nature. He has pushed things even a step further and just come out and said, yes, this it's for the oil. We're going to take the oil. We're going to run Venezuela. Um, is I want to talk about the impact that the kidnapping of Maduro and Flores is going to have on other countries in this hemisphere, particularly. I know that Trump has made threats against Colombia, against Mexico, against Cuba, of course, against Greenland. So, what thinking specifically of countries that have taken a kind of anti-imperialist direction, Brazil, Colombia, for example. What's likely to happen, Steve, in those uh, areas?
Yeah, Scott, I think you have to distinguish between the immediate response of these countries, and by the way, they're moderate, uh, progressive countries, but moderate progressives, not more hardline progressive as is Venezuela. But we have to distinguish between the immediate response and what I would say would be the medium term and certainly the long term future. Immediately, the response has been fairly firm. Mexico, Brazil, Colombia have criticized the operation, the kidnapping of Maduro and Cilia Flores. Um, but they issued a statement. There was a statement that was issued along with Spain, which criticized what happened, but didn't even call for the immediate release of Maduro and Flores. So the response has been critical, but perhaps not critical enough. But I think that is explained by the fact that these heads of states realize that Trump is, to put it bluntly, capricious. He's fickle, and that any kind of statement that they make might prejudice their economic relations with the United States in terms of tariffs and in terms of a possible military threat. I mean, just now, Trump threatened Colombia with all kinds of actions, called Gustavo Petro a cocaine person who was promoting the production of cocaine. But after a friendly telephone conversation that lasted about an hour, Trump changed his line on Colombia. So Scheinbaum in Mexico, Lula in Brazil know that. Incidentally, Lula's position was better, was more firm, was firmer than that of Scheinbaum, and that can be explained by the fact that Mexico is more dependent economically on the United States. There's more economic commerce, between Mexico and the United States. In the case of Brazil, Brazil's main trading partner is China, not the United States. So the economic factor enters in. But I think we've got to distinguish between the immediate reaction on the part of these three leaders and others, such as the president of Uruguay and Chile, the current president of Chile. He's still in office. And the medium-term and long-term situation. And that is that we can see now that there is popular opposition to Trump's threats and Trump's actions. For instance, in the case of Ecuador, the president of Ecuador, Noboa, won the elections, apparently, although there were accusations of fraud, but okay, he won the elections. And shortly after that, there was a referendum in that country about reestablishing the U.S. military base in Manta. And it was defeated by a large majority of the vote, even though Noboa and Noam, who traveled to Ecuador to promote this proposition, nevertheless, it was defeated, and it was heavily defeated. In the case of Argentina, Trump offered Argentina $40 billion, and this plays into Rosanna's point about how this affects the United States. I mean, $40 billion telling Argentinians if Javier Milei's party won the congressional elections, they'd get that money. If the opposition won, the money would not be forthcoming. And leaders across the political spectrum, from the left, from the Peronists to the centrists, the Radical Party, which is a centrist pro-neoliberal party, they all call that blackmail, which is exactly what it was. So we see, throughout Latin America, popular opposition to Trump's actions. And I believe that really indicates what's going to be the medium term and certainly the long term effect of Trump's actions and his rhetoric. Even, like I mentioned before, in the case of Venezuela, Enrique Capriles, who is, in my opinion, not a good guy, but nevertheless has taken some intelligent, assumed some good positions. He is opposing Trump's rhetoric on immigration because he's saying really bad things about Venezuelans. He's opposing the sanctions against Venezuela, the economic sanctions that have strangled Venezuela economically, and he's opposed the military actions of Trump in the Caribbean. So I think this really shines light on what the medium-term and long-term effect is going to be.
Thank you. And Rosanna, I want to kind of seize on something that Steve just brought out there, which was this blackmail, right? This use of money as a tool of leverage. Like, we're gonna, if you go along with us, we'll give you the money. If you don't, we're gonna withhold it. And that's something that we see here as well, right? It seems like the Trump regime has been doing that kind of since the beginning.
Well, yeah, in California, he immediately came after California and said, I'm gonna stop all federal funding to California. And he and Newsom had some words where Newsom says, "Well, come and get me," and Newsom, the governor of California, pointed out that it's not possible that California actually contributes more to the federal government than than the receipts from the federal government. And so there was, and Trump has continually said he's going to go after the blue states, anybody who opposes him and stuff like that. It's just a bullying tactic. It's a manipulative tactic, and which he probably has used all of his life to get what he wants. And I think what the American people have to show is that not here, not with us at the American people. And that's why I think it's hopeful that people have hit the streets, are calling their members of Congress, are preparing for the midterm elections, are showing up to town halls and holding Republicans accountable for their actions and for their votes. Um, and so I think that what's really important is the impact that we can have here in the United States. And it's important to remember that the impact that we can have here in the United States impacts the entire world. So we're not just doing it for ourselves. We're doing it for the entire world. And I think that's a really important responsibility that we have, but it's also an important impact that we can have uh, throughout this country, throughout this world. I think, you know, uh, once again, we just have to be much more vigilant about what we're told, where we're going, what we're doing, what we're thinking. Is really, I think, to me, the most important part of what we here in the United States, and what that outcome is going to be is determined by our actions, and more importantly, I wholeheartedly stress that we do not let up. I know it's hard, you know, it's hard to see people on the streets, more and more people on the streets. It's hard to see the people who are being shot at by these thugs. Uh, but let's not let up. Let's not let fear dominate us. Yes, we have to take care of our mental health, and yes, it's okay to take a day off or a breather, but let's not give in. Let us not, let's continue the resistance, continue it in every other form, in every form that's possible, because it's so really super critical to our survival, and really to the survival of the world. So that's my rant.
Yeah, no, you raise a really crucial point that the people of the United States, the working class in particular of the United States, is the working class of the world's leading imperialist power, has a special responsibility to struggle against U.S. imperialism, and we have an interest in doing that. It was reported yesterday or the day before that the Trump regime is now asking for a 50% increase in next year's military budget, another $500 billion dollars on top of what has already been stripped out of funding for the poor, to provide tax cuts for the rich and funding for fascist repression at home and imperialist repression abroad. So that's like we have to stay out there, and I wanted to. We're approaching the end of our show, but I wanted to um, kind of mention a trend that I've seen in the capitalist press lately, which is more and more attention to or fetishization, in fact, of this idea that Cuba is about to collapse. That you know, cutting off the supply of Venezuelan oil is going to cripple Cuba and bring down the revolution. And I'm going to maybe ask this question to both Rosanna and Steve. A like is that likely? Is the Cuban Revolution like on the brink of collapse? And B, why are Cuba is a tiny country. It has zero economic importance to the United States. Why is the United States so insistent? Why is the U.S. ruling class so insistent on establishing control over Cuba? Um, that's a question for both of you. I don't know who wants to take a crack at it first.
Go ahead.
Rosanna? Rosanna, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. I'm coughing a lot, so I I don't consider myself like an expert to determine what's going to happen in Cuba. They're under a very difficult situation, uh, and so, but I believe that the attacks on Cuba are designed because Cuba, in spite of everything, is an example of what is possible in this tiny nation. They have free healthcare, education, jobs, housing. Yes, they don't have, the major commodities, I guess you would call them, but that's because that's the fault of the United States and the blockade, not because the nation itself and the government itself is not providing it. And that's, once again, being clear about what's happening. So I think it's an example of what is possible if in a small little nation like that can provide those basic needs for its people in spite of the blockade, then why can't the United States do that? And and the longer the Cuba continues in this path, the the United States doesn't want to be able to say, oh, socialism doesn't work, or communism doesn't work, or leftists don't work, that kind of a thing. You can't, because you have nations that are making it work, that are meeting the needs of the people, which is what we in the United States want, is our needs met. And we're not asking for anything that we have not earned, because our tax dollars are what provides those kinds of things. So uh, I think the Cuban people, if anything happens, they will fight to the end to keep what they have. That's my thinking. I don't know. What do you think, Steve?
Well, yeah, I agree, and I think that specifically with regard to the question about why Cuba, we've got to distinguish between Marco Rubio, who's really the architect behind these actions, who has staked his political career. He stated throughout his political career that he is going to bring down the government of Cuba, and then more recently he talked about Venezuela, and sees regime change in Venezuela as the first step, and Cuba being the end game. But I think, to answer your question, why is the ruling class in the United States, harping on this? It's not really strategic in an economic sense. The answer has a lot to do with U.S. capitalism. U.S. capitalism is in a crisis situation. There's this big disparity between the speculative economy and the real economy. And there's so much of the speculative economy that keeps the economy moving, creates jobs for the time being, but is really artificial. The debt, I mean, the central government's debt of $37 trillion, it's a Ponzi scheme. And overaccumulation, in Marxist terms, overaccumulation, the tendency, the falling rate of profit, is a tendency, which Marx talked about that, really means there's a reluctance to invest. That's the problem facing the US economy. There just isn't a market out there for investments. The system needs something that shoots adrenaline into the system. And any kind of change, I mean, in the case of Cuba, a country that represents socialism during a period of 60 years or so or more, this would create a sense of optimism and investments, which is what the economy needs. And I think that has a lot to do with this, hyped up interest in bringing about regime change in Cuba.
Thank you. And that's that makes perfect sense. It's also just thinking of, like, I don't know, sort of hideous dystopian nature of that. The incredible suffering that our ruling class is willing to inflict on us, on any country in the world. Um, it raises the question of, yeah, of what do we do? And I think, Rosanna, you already answered that. We have to stay out in the streets. We have to keep up the pressure. We have to target the companies that are benefiting from this, the banks that are benefiting from this, and pressure works. I know some people are skeptical about something like calling representatives and writing them, but the Senate has just taken the first step toward reining in Trump's war powers. They passed a war powers resolution. That's a long struggle to actually make that a real thing, but it's part of the fight to as Steve talked about earlier, to radicalize the people's movements here and to um, build a force that's actually capable of creating profound change. Um, and I just want to reiterate, our solidarity with the people of Venezuela, with the people of Cuba, of Mexico, of Colombia, of every country in the world targeted by U.S. imperialism, suffering under U.S. imperialism. And as Joe always says, stay strong, stay safe, and stay in the fight. Thank you very much, comrades, for joining us this morning.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank, thank you.